no test afterwards.
The test is when you go home and use water. Did you learn anything tonight?
All right, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. For those of you streaming, and I hope there are many, welcome, and welcome to you all. Thank you for being here. And I would like to present Steve Snyder, who is 10 years with Denver Water, and he's one of the newbies, he says. He's a native of Colorado and passionate about what he's doing. So here's Steve Snyder.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. No need. Save it at the end if it actually meant something to you. First question, any repeat customers from a few weeks ago from the Whatnots group? You can, I won't be mad if you leave. Literally nothing has changed. It must have been okay if you came back for a second time, so. How much time do you want me to fill?
Till about 7:15. Is that what we've got, 7:15? And then questions.
Yeah, perfect. So, again, my name is Steve Snyder. I work in the Public Affairs Department at Denver Water. One of my jobs is I run our Speakers Bureau, in that either I go out and do a lot of these presentations when it's kind of a general high-level overview of Denver Water and some of the water issues facing our state. I also manage our other folks, water quality experts, engineers. When our executives have speaking engagements, I work on the logistics for that. I also do I run our tours program. We do offer tours of some of our facilities, specifically our water treatment plants. We do public tours of our treatment plants starting in April, either the first or second Friday in April through October. If you go to our website, denverwater.org, put in tours, you can find out how to sign up. Typically, we tour the Marston treatment plant. If you've ever been over on the west side of town, driving south on Wadsworth, looked over to your left and wondered what that big body of water was over there, we'll show that to you as part of the tour. So today, I will talk to you a little bit about Denver Water itself, give you a little bit of an overview. But really what we're talking about today or tonight will be larger water issues that are not only facing the state, but a lot of the western U.S. So how many Denver Water customers do we actually have here? Okay, a handful. So even those of you who aren't, there will definitely be something here for you. So if you could, that first slide, please. A little bit about us. We are actually the largest and oldest water utility in the state. Founded back in 1918. We celebrated our 100-year anniversary back a few years ago. Truly a once-in-a-lifetime experience. And we're all of a certain age where we remember a lot of places that were around for a while that aren't anymore. May DNF, Denver Dry, is Sears still around? All of these places that were around at one point. All of this to say, Denver Water's probably got another 100 years in her or so. We serve about 1.5 million people. That's about 25% of the state's population, and we only use about 2% of the water used in the state to do it. That surprises a lot of people. They think cities are the ones who use most of the water. We'll talk specifically about water consumption in just a few minutes. Do about 55,000 water quality samples and 200,000 tests a year, all in the name of providing a safe, reliable drinking water supply. Our water supply itself comes from mountain snowpack. Up in the high country, it has been a very good year. It has been a drag down here, I know, but it has been very good for the water supply, and if we can just have a nice, cold, wet spring, we'll be in excellent shape rolling into the summer months. We get that water from both the South Platte and the Colorado River basins. We have about 4,000 square miles of what we call watershed area. When I say watershed, think about when that snowpack melts and that water is running down the ground to a river or stream. That ground that it's running on is called watershed. That 4,000 miles of watershed area actually makes us the third largest public landowner in the state, behind only the state and the federal government. Some other fancy numbers: about 1,100 employees, 3,000 miles of pipes, 20 dams, 12 reservoirs, 4 treatment plants, 18 pump stations, a very big, complex operation. Next slide, if you will, please. We actually serve water not only within the city and county of Denver. Let me back up, because it's actually important to note there is a separation between Denver Water and the city of Denver. I am actually a Denver Water employee, not a city and county of Denver employee. Back in 1918, when the citizens of Denver voted to acquire the Denver Union Water Company, they had the foresight to understand that they wanted to separate water from politics. 100 years later, mixed reviews on how it actually worked, but we are actually run by a 5-person board of water commissioners. They are appointed by the mayor, but they take that separation very seriously. But this map shows that we not only serve water within the city and county of Denver, which is that yellow area there, city and county proper, but we also do serve throughout the metro area through a network of distributors. We provide water to these distributors. Sometimes they maintain their own systems, build their own customers. Sometimes we do it for them, but Denver Water does actually have a reach beyond just the city and county of Denver, which is how we get to that 1.5 million. Next slide, please. This slide is a map of our collection system. 2 things to point out to you here. First of all, actually 3 things. First, the 2 colored in areas. That area in kind of lime green is our north collection system. The area in the big yellow is our south collection system. We're very clever with our naming acronyms at Denver Water. But one thing you'll notice, the north system is much smaller than the south. Our north collection system includes both Gross and Ralston Reservoir. Our south system includes Dillon Reservoir as well as a number of reservoirs along the South Platte, including Antero, 11 Mile, Cheeseman, and Strongest Springs. That difference in size, though, we get about 80% of our water supply from that south collection system. However, when we have severe wildfires in that area, and specifically going back to, I think it was 98 with the Buffalo Creek fire, and then in 2000 or 2001, I forget, with the Hayman fire. Those were both right in the heart of our south collection system. It really impacts our ability to collect and treat water from that area, relying on the north smaller system to really take care of our entire service area. So part of what we've been doing lately is trying to equal out, make the north system more resilient, a little bit more sustainable. I'll talk about that in just a minute as well. The other thing I'll draw your attention to are those 3 words up there. I mentioned 4,000 square miles of watershed, 3,000 miles of pipe, 20 dams, 12 reservoirs, et cetera, et cetera. But really, what everybody at Denver Water is doing, for the most part, on a daily basis, is focused on the collection, treatment, and distribution of water to our customers. Kind of helps simplify things a bit. Next slide, please. Another very complicated looking slide, which is actually appropriate because this slide will explain why water is so complicated in Colorado. So this is a map of the state. Think about the Continental Divide running right down the middle of the state, as it does. Those big blue arrows are the major rivers in Colorado. We've got the Colorado, the White, the Yampa, South Platte, etc. You'll notice there are more and bigger arrows pointing west. That's because on any given year here in the state, about 80% of the precipitation that falls here in the state falls on the western half of the Continental Divide, and all that water flows west toward the Pacific Ocean. Only about 20% of the precipitation actually makes it across the Continental Divide and falls here on the eastern half. However, think about where the population is here in Colorado, mainly focused here on the Front Range. In fact, you can pretty accurately flip those numbers to about 80% of the population here in Colorado is on the eastern half of the Continental Divide. So simply put, the water is not where the people are in Colorado. However, because of the way water laws are here in Colorado and in much of the western US, we have the ability to move water around. Water law in Colorado, and I am not a lawyer, so this is going to be a very high-level explanation. Got any lawyers in here? Any water law? Oh, water law?
I took a course.
Okay. Feel free to jump in if I misstep. Water law in Colorado is based on a principle called prior appropriation. Another way of saying first in time, first in right. In other words, it's not necessarily about where the water is located, it's about who got to the water first and put a claim on it. And by a claim, that's going to a water court. We have a lot of them here in Colorado, and you basically get a decree or an order that says you are allowed to take X amount of water out of that particular water source, and it's going to be in a particular priority. It's all about who gets to water first. So I'll take you back to the late 1800s, and the city of Denver being founded on the banks of the Cherry Creek in the South Platte. The people who founded the city of Denver and who would go on to found Denver Water had the foresight to understand that South Platte River water alone was not going to be enough to eventually sustain this growing metro area that we live in today. So they set out across the Continental Divide looking for other water sources and were able to secure water rights on the Colorado River. I mentioned we get it from the South Platte and the Colorado River basins. We get about 50% of our water supply from the South Platte, which makes sense in Denver, it runs right through us. We get the other 50% from the Colorado River. It's called a trans-basin diversion. We bring that water from the west slope straight through the Continental Divide, through either the Roberts or the Moffett Tunnel, and we bring that water to our citizens. Have the legal right to do it. We have fairly senior water rights on both the Colorado and the South Platte. However, even though we have the legal right to divert water from the west slope, as you can imagine, when you divert water from one place to another, the place you diverted that water from isn't always very happy about things. And Denver Water has a very long and contentious history with the west slope. If any of you want to read more about the subject of water, particularly water in the west and water in the city of Denver, there is a book called A Ditch in Time, written by a professor named Patricia Limerick. She's a professor up at CU Boulder. She's done a lot of work around the American West, and particularly water. A Ditch in Time basically chronicles the history of water within the city of Denver and how it helped grow the city. Kind of becomes an unofficial history of Denver water. We contributed a lot of material to it. We did not have the final say in it. And I will tell you, as you read it, you see that Denver Water had some very single-minded people that worked for them back in the day. They had a mission to bring a safe, reliable water supply to its citizens, and if they made some enemies along the way, so be it. Our folks who work up in Grand and Summit County at some of our facilities there will tell you there was a time you would not go out in public identifying yourself as working at Denver Water because somebody was going to come up and tell you about how much they enjoyed Denver Water. Our trucks used to have snowballs and tomatoes thrown at them. Very contentious relationship. It's gotten better through the years, and I'll talk about a few ways why, but it's not necessarily even just Denver Water. It really is the idea of West Slope versus Front Range water use has been a source of contention for a number of years and still is to this day. And this map here kind of explains why. The water is not where the people are. We have the ability to move that water around, but in a lot of cases, it has been a zero-sum game where somebody wins and somebody loses. And that's what we're trying to fix. I'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide. So the other big contentious issue around water in Colorado is the idea of agricultural versus urban water use. As you can see by the graph behind me, agriculture far and away accounts for the largest water use in Colorado. The challenge with all of this is that obviously we have a very rich agricultural history in Colorado. And clearly the products that agriculture produces are vital to our way of life. But our cities continue to grow. A lot of times they are the economic engines of our state. And as more people move into these cities, our cities continue to grow, they need more water. Inevitably, we start to look to agriculture and the amount of water that they use. There are a lot of other issues that go into this. We could talk for an entire hour on just some of the issues about how our water laws are very old and inflexible and actually de-incent agriculture on conservation measures in a lot of different ways. But that's the other piece to understand. Not only do you have this Front Range versus West Slope arguing over water, but you also have the idea of agricultural versus Front Range, because ag is such a large user of water, not only in Colorado, but in many states in the western U.S. Next slide. So with that in mind, I've kind of set the stage for a few things. Let's talk about some water management challenges. Certainly these are ones that are impacting Denver water, but these impact every water utility here in the state, and really as you go across the western U.S., they impact those as well. So next slide, please. The first one we'll talk about is warming climate and climate change. It is very important for me to note here that Denver Water is an apolitical organization. We don't take sides, we don't point fingers or try to assess blame. Climate change can be a very politically charged topic in a lot of areas. This is simply our recognition of what a changing climate, and particularly the warming piece of it, is doing to our water supply. Our mountain snowpack is now melting about 3 weeks earlier than it did just 10 years ago. Over the past 5 to 10 years, we have seen great snowpack in February and March end up dissolving into half what we thought by April and May. The way that this really impacts Denver water is through our ability to plan for the future. Water utilities everywhere have planners, for want of a better term. We call them, it's our water resource strategy division. But these are folks who plan our water future for our customers 50 plus years out. And typically, over the past several decades, one of the biggest tools they would use for predicting the future would be looking at the past and past data, whether it be climate records, hydrological records, growth patterns, where people want to live, every kind of different data point you could look at in the past, with the idea that it might give us an idea of what the future has in store. But particularly as we're dealing with a changing climate, that has become more and more challenging. A couple examples come to mind. I'll start with going back almost 10 years now to 2013, if any of you were here at that point. Rack your memory, you might remember it was a very dry winter, January, February, even into March. We started getting worried about our water supply, but then mid to late March it started snowing. If you might remember, it literally snowed like every other day for like a couple of weeks. Did a pretty good job busting the drought. But then it dried out again in the summer. We saw another bad wildfire season. And then in September, and for those of you that have lived here for a while, September is usually one of the nicest and one of the driest months we have here in Colorado. We saw those devastating floods up north in September of 2013. I don't have to go more than a year back when we talk about the Marshall Fire, a wildfire in Colorado in December. When you think of the climate conditions that came together at that point, but that were exacerbated by longer term implications. And that makes our planners' jobs that much more difficult. So they have actually now moved to what's called scenario planning. This is where they essentially imagine several different futures and then plan for each one of them, kind of contingency plan for each one. At a very high level, what they've done is they've got a pretty good idea that based on the climate studies that have been done, we are going to continue to see warmer temperatures here in Colorado over the next 10 to 20 years. But whether that results in a warmer and drier climate, which tends to make sense, or it could actually end up with a warmer and wetter climate. And by that I mean you may not have as many precipitation events, but those precipitation events will be more extreme. I give you the last 12 months of the calendar year here as an example. If you remember back this past summer, we had a number of rainstorms where you were getting 2 to 3 inches of rain an hour. And then that lovely snowstorm that hit in mid-December that wasn't the light, beautiful, fluffy stuff that we all love here in December in Colorado. No, it was that wet, heavy stuff that sticks around forever. Those are the type of things that make planning for the future very challenging for our folks, and it's all being driven by a changing climate. The next slide is growth. How many of you are Colorado natives? Okay, that's about right for this size of group. There's fewer and fewer of us. We're a dying breed, it feels like. How many of you have been here for quite some time, 20 plus years or so? Okay, now we're getting there. So, again, being a native, I'm a 6th generation native. My kids are 7th. I told them they can't move. They need to keep that legacy going. But growing up here, I can remember when I became age to drive, driving from Denver to Colorado Springs and not seeing development all the way down. Some of you old school folks remember those subdivisions in Highlands Ranch and that area down there didn't used to exist. But here in Colorado, as in many western US states, because we have a lot of land to grow, we grow out. If you go back, any of you are from the East Coast or visit those East Coast cities a lot, they're landlocked, their growth has to go up. Managing growth up is much easier than out, because when you grow out, you create urban sprawl, which really stresses your infrastructure around transportation, energy, and water. Specific to water, I'll give you the example of Highlands Ranch and a lot of communities in southern and most of Douglas County. If any of you remember, Douglas County was one of the faster growing counties in the country for a number of years in the late 80s into the 90s. But because they were new communities, there wasn't water available on any of those river basins that I told you about. Most of the water on those rivers was already allocated. So a lot of communities in Douglas County have relied on underground aquifers for their water. Problem with that is that once you deplete an underground aquifer, it doesn't just come right back. It is a very slow renewing natural resource. So there are a lot of communities in Douglas County that have spent the better part of the last decade working on ways to find a more sustainable water supply. We'll talk about one of those programs here again in just a moment. But the idea of growth and obviously putting a closed sign up on our borders isn't going to work. People continue to move to our state because they love what a wonderful place it is. So we have to figure out, how do we manage our growth effectively so that it does not stress that infrastructure around transportation, energy, and water. And then finally, we have the crisis on the Colorado River Basin. So I've been doing a version of this presentation for probably 6 or 7 years. When I first started doing it and I would talk about the Colorado River Basin, people looked at me like, what is that? How many of you have heard about problem in the Colorado River Basin over the last few months? Exactly. Our CEO, way back when, liken this problem to a slow-moving train heading right for us, in that if we get hit, we being the 7 states in the Colorado River Basin, if we get hit, it's our own fault. And sure enough, now that train is a lot closer than it was before. So, let me take you back again to the 1800s, early to mid-1800s, and the migration of people from east to west in our country, coming out to all of these great American cities in the West looking for the new American dream. And as you settle a community, you need a water supply. And particularly in Southern California, and specifically around Southern California agriculture, a lot of groups were being very aggressive in getting water rights on the Colorado River. To the point that in 1922, the Federal Bureau of Reclamation stepped in and brokered what is known as the Colorado River Compact. It was 100 years old last year. It's a fairly short document, actually, only about 5 pages. You can Google it, read it pretty quickly. It is part of a larger group of documents that basically govern how the river basin water is managed. Those larger documents together are called the Law of the River. A lot of different dynamics come into that. The country of Mexico comes in, Native American tribes play into all of this. But from a very high level, what the Colorado River Compact did was it broke the basin states up into the upper basin states of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, and the lower basin states of, hang on, did I say California first? No, okay, yeah. Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, and the lower basin states of California, Arizona, and Nevada. It then essentially divvied up the river and gave a specific amount of water in a year, looking at it over a 10-year rolling average, to the upper basin states, and a specific amount to the lower basin states, basically almost in half, 7.5 million acre feet to each basin. If you're curious, an acre foot of water, picture 1 acre of land 1 foot deep in water. It's about 326,000 gallons, I believe. It's how we express big sums of water. If you're trying to, Dillon Reservoir is about 230,000 acre feet. If we're trying to express that in gallons, there's a whole bunch of zeros to deal with. So we talk about acre feet. The key to all of that was that it was set amounts given to the upper and to the lower basins, and then they kind of divided among themselves within the states. Not percentages, which has come back to bite us in the proverbial fanny, so to speak, because 100 years later, we are seeing some major problems with the compact. Number one being that back in the 1920s, when they were figuring out how much water the Colorado River could essentially yield, 100 years later, looking back at the hydrology records, we know now that that was probably one of the wettest periods in the basin's history. Didn't know it at the time, we do know it now. You throw in drought, you throw in climate change, and you throw in growth. If you'll click the next slide, please. This is what you get. This is affectionately known as the bathtub ring at Lake Powell. There's a very similar one at Lake Mead in Nevada. I don't know if any of you have vacationed to either Powell or Mead lately, but if you did, you have undoubtedly seen it. It is very dramatic. That line there is where the water level used to be in both of those reservoirs and has continually dropped over the past 10 to 20 years. Very similar to if you have a checking account or a savings account and you were constantly taking more out than you were putting in, your money is going to start going down like these water levels have. And that's what's happened in the Colorado River Basin. We know now that the river was never, based on what they did and that specific amount, to your point, it was never going to be able to keep up with that specific pace. And when you throw in all of these other variables, The problem becomes, though, very similar to what I talked about with water law here in Colorado. Very same thing applies with Western water law, in that there are people within the Colorado River Basin who have very senior water rights, specifically Southern California and agriculture, specifically the Imperial Agricultural District in Southern California, not a state secret by any means. And even though they are not the lower basin states, and specifically California, specifically these groups, are not taking more than they're allowed, they're continuing to drain these rivers. Powell and Mead are the two rivers that basically keep the water accounted for within the river basin. Lake Powell is essentially the piggy bank where the upper basins store water to send down to Lake Mead to fulfill the obligations under the Colorado River Compact. You may have heard within the last, I think it was about 6 months ago now or so, the Bureau of Reclamation came out and said, hey, we have a real problem here. All of you need to figure out a way to cut back usage. About 2 to 4 million acre feet was their request. It wasn't a mandate yet. There wasn't a hard deadline yet. Some people did some things. I'll talk about one of the things that Denver Water and a number of other utilities did. Others have not. Again, I'll let you take a guess who isn't on board with a lot of this stuff right now. But that's the situation that we're in with the Colorado River. We get a question a lot of times, specifically when working at Denver Water. People find out I work there, friends, family, whatever. They ask, why are we selling all of our water to California? Or why don't we charge California and Arizona and Nevada more? Well, simple answer is it's not our water. We are literally all in this together. We are bound together, these 7 states, by this compact. And these more senior water rights technically could have a right within the compact, the way it's written. If lower basin states, and specifically the ones with the most senior water rights, don't get what they're entitled to, they could require upper basin states to curtail their usage. Now that would require a lot of lawyers and a lot of time in court, which nobody wants to go through, but at this point, that's what we're headed toward, a stalemate over who gets to use what water. If the Bureau of Reclamation steps in and says, nope, for the greater good, you're all going to take certain cutbacks so we can sustain everything. There might be litigation on that as well, but as you continue to hear about it in the news, know that this has been a long, ongoing fight for utilities like Denver Water, major water utilities throughout the western United States as we deal with this. So, I've given you the doom and gloom. Let's talk about solutions. These 3 I'm talking about aren't unique to Denver Water by any means. They are specific to our strategy, though. We call it 3 legs of a stool, or the all of the above approach. It's basically 3 concepts: the idea of water conservation / efficiency, water reuse, and new supply. So if you go to the first slide in conservation and efficiency. So Denver Water has been we do believe we've been a leader in conservation for the better part of the 21st century. Specifically, if you go back to the early 2000s, and that second bullet point up there, through the intense outreach and education that we started in the early 2000s, our customers cut back their water usage by a little over 20%, despite a 10% growth in population, so more people using less water. For those of you that lived in the area then, you saw our Use Only What You Need campaigns, people like me going out and talking about where the water comes from, why it's important to be water efficient, working with neighborhood groups, working with large water users like schools and hospitals, working with different industries like the brewing industry, even now the marijuana industry, really working on the idea of conservation of water. We've morphed a little bit lately into water efficiency because it allows us to be a little bit more customer-centric or targeted in our approach. I don't know if for those of you who are Denver Water customers and you get your bill each month, you should be getting something in there that says either you're doing a good job using water efficiently or, hey, you could be doing better. And in fact, some of your neighbors are actually probably being more efficient than you. That comes from our folks developing benchmarks based on how many people are in a household and what efficient use of indoor water looks like for that number of people, as well as for the basic size of your landscape and what efficient outdoor use of water looks like for that. If you're right at or below that benchmark, we give you the thumbs up. If not, we probably have given you suggestions on how you can improve your efficiency either indoor or out. This gives us a chance to work much more individually with people. Conservation sometimes implies the idea of sacrifice as well. I live in Colorado, I want to have a nice landscape, but forget it, I'll just throw down rock. That's not what we want either. You can have a healthy, vibrant landscape. It's actually critical to a lot of the things that make life worth living here in Colorado. So efficiency and conservation have been a big part of kind of how we move forward with that. Next is water reuse. The picture you see there is of our water recycling plant. That was kind of the poster child of water reuse for quite a while from Denver Water. We have a treatment plant that recycles water. It is right next to Metro Wastewater's main treatment plant down near 56th in New York. Metro Wastewater is the main water treatment agency for most of the wastewater that's created in the Denver metro area. All of that water that comes out of homes and businesses is wastewater, goes into Metro's plant. They treat that water to the standard where it is deemed safe to be reintroduced back into the environment. They put that water in the South Platte and let it flow downstream for other water users downstream to use. Denver Water takes some of that water before Metro puts it in the South Platte, after they've treated it, but before it goes into the South Platte. We bring it into our water recycling plant and we treat it again. Not to a potable standard, but to a very high quality standard, and then we provide it to certain customers for non-potable purposes. Denver parks and a lot of golf courses use our recycled water for irrigation. If you've ever been around, not just Denver, but any parks in the metro area, and you see a sign that says, "This area is being irrigated with non-potable water, please do not drink," that's recycled water that's being used for irrigation. Denver Zoo uses our water in its exhibits and for irrigation, and our XL Energy is actually our biggest customer, which uses our recycled water in our cooling towers. This not only reuses a source of water, but it puts the right water source to the right water use. And that's where this thing called One Water comes in, a One Water strategy. So we, at least from Denver Water's and a lot of water utilities perspective, we have access to a lot of different water sources. We have our raw water, which is what we call our mountain snowmelt, that water supply that hasn't been treated yet. We bring it into our water treatment plants, we turn it into potable or drinking water that goes into homes and businesses. That water comes out of homes and businesses either as black water or wastewater or gray water. You can turn either one of those into recycled water. Then you also have storm water and you also have rainwater. So you have all of these different sources of water, and they all tend to be regulated differently. A One Water strategy says, let's look at all these water sources and manage them holistically and put the right water source to the right water use. And again, this is something that a water utility can do. This isn't necessarily something a lot of you can do at home, although there are a few options available. But specific to this One Water concept, we just redeveloped our operations complex down near 6th and I-25. We are using that One Water concept there in terms of we have an on-site wastewater treatment system that takes the wastewater from our toilets and urinals in the administration building, treats it on site, turns it into recycled water, and brings it back around, and we're able to flush our toilets with recycled water. We capture rainwater from the roof of our parking garage in our administration building, and we use it for irrigation. We do passive stormwater treatment to provide an extra layer of treatment before stormwater runs into the rivers. It's using all of those available water sources and putting the right water source to the right water use. And as we have started to refine that strategy, we can work with other customers, whether they're large operational industrial complexes like ours, whether they're multifamily units being built or being redeveloped. We worked out at the National Western redevelopment on some One Water concepts out there, but it's all around this idea of reusing water and putting the right water source to the right water use. And then finally, we have new supply. There is a reason this is last, because it is very challenging to do right now, and Denver Water actually was part of a very big reason why. If any of you remember, back in the early 80s, a project Denver Water was working on called Two Forks. Two Forks was going to be the latest dam project Denver Water was going to do. It was going to be on the North Fork of the South Platte. It was basically the way water utilities operated forever. Need more water supply, find a place to call the dam, build the dam, call it a day. If you remember, it sounded so simple back then. If you remember, though, back in the 80s, that was when environmentalism was coming to the forefront. People were more environmentally conscious. Environmental groups had a lot more power, to the point where the EPA vetoed the Two Forks project back in 1988, essentially bringing an end to the big dam building era in this country. More dams are actually being torn down now than are being built. Building a new water supply project is extremely challenging, and I give you the Gross Reservoir Expansion project as an example. The EPA came out and said, as an alternative to building a new dam, Two Forks, why don't you expand the size of Gross Reservoir? It was built so that you could raise the height of the dam. We said, great. So we set about the process of raising Gross Reservoir about 131 feet, I believe it is. It took us 15 years in the permitting process alone, from working to get in with the Army Corps of Engineers to get an environmental impact statement, a couple of fights in court over that. Had to work with the Federal Energy Regulation Commission because there's a hydro facility there. We had numerous discussions, arguments, legal fights with some environmental groups. Obviously, Boulder County wasn't thrilled with this particular project, and it took 15 years with the permitting process before we were finally able to start the project in April of last year. Still got about another, I believe, 4 years to go. So there's a reason this is third on the list. It's certainly not the go-to option anymore. Conservation and efficiency, as well as reuse, are much more viable, much more important options, but we don't take this off the table. We have gravel pits out in Commerce City that we use. We've experimented with injecting water into underground aquifers to be able to retrieve it. So it's not necessarily, new supply is not just about building dams, but again, the history of it and where we have has made it very challenging. And then finally, the last slide, and I'll take some questions. The idea of collaboration and partnerships. As I mentioned, Denver Water had some very single-minded individuals who worked for us back in the day, and collaboration was not a word they really believed in. But probably in the 70s, 80s, starting under the leadership of Chips Berry and that Board of Water Commissioners, and then now continuing with our current CEO, Jim Lockett, and this Board of Commissioners, we really have embraced the idea of collaboration and partnerships, and the idea that zero-sum games don't work. There doesn't always have to be a winner and a loser when you're having negotiations and when you're trying to work out issues, specifically involving a shared resource like water. Some of these things listed up here are things that never would have happened 40, 50 years ago. Colorado River Cooperative Agreement is an agreement we have with about 30 different entities in Summit and Grand County. The basic gist of it is now that rather than just diverting the water from the west slope and not worrying about the impacts, we actually work side by side with a number of different entities. You think about our biggest water supply source is Dillon Reservoir. That is a huge economic engine for most of Summit County, particularly around recreation. So we work carefully with them, particularly in runoff season, to manage inflows and outflows, make sure there's water available for recreation. Obviously, the ski industry, huge economic impact, making sure that the ski resorts have water available for snowmaking. And then working with environmental groups to make sure that stream flows are optimal, stream temperatures are optimal for sustaining aquatic wildlife, that the environment and the communities that we're diverting water from are not negatively impacted by our doing that. The Colorado River MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, this stems from the Bureau of Reclamation's ask to reduce 2 to 4 million acre feet worth of Colorado River water use. So with Denver Water, Aurora Water, Colorado Springs Water, the major water provider in Nevada and the major water provider in Los Angeles, along with about 8 or 9 other water providers, we all sent an MOU to the Bureau of Reclamation pledging to do individual things to try to reduce Colorado River water usage. It could be different for every utility. From Denver Water's perspective, our focus is reducing non-functional turf in our service area by about 30%. When I say non-functional turf, we define that as turf that is only used when you walk on it to mow it. Think about the grass in the middle of a median in the street. That strip of grass between the sidewalk and the street that never gets used. We're not talking about people's lawns, we're not talking about parks and schools and things like that, but once you start to think about it, you look around, you see how much turf is out there that's just not serving any purpose. Going to commit to reducing that and not just putting in rock, but being thoughtful about the kind of landscaping Colorado native that we put in. WISE stands for Water Infrastructure Supply Efficiency. That is that agreement I talked about between Denver Water and some of the water providers in South Douglas County, about a dozen South Metro area water providers, where we take water. Denver Water has the ability to reuse. We send it to Aurora Water, who treats that water in its Prairie Waters facility and then pipes it down to those South Metro area water providers. Literally the entire metro area working together to make sure that everybody has a sustainable water supply. From Forest to Faucet, it's a really cool program. We provide funding to the U.S. and state Forest Service to do priority wildfire mitigation in some of the areas where we collect water. Obviously, not only are wildfires devastating to our communities and to the environment, but they have long-lasting water quality and water source issues. Think about that mountain snowpack melting and running through a pristine mountain forest versus running through a burn scar. That program has been amazing. And then the Highline Canal, anybody walk that, bike it, use it for rec? So that has been owned from Denver Water, by Denver Water from the beginning. It was original purpose was an irrigation delivery system to a lot of agricultural users on the canal. Through the years, a lot of those customers have moved on, and it has become a very inefficient way to deliver water. Leaks like you wouldn't believe. It is inefficient. But as this show of hands indicates, it has become a very important recreational and an environmental amenity in the metro area. So a number of years back, we partnered with a group called the Highline Conservancy, as well as the 8 different jurisdictions that the canal runs through, and we figured out a way to basically transition from this idea of a water delivery system. It is now being used for several stormwater management pilot projects with the idea that it can sustain the environmental benefits that we had from running the water through there while still allowing for the recreational aspects that all of you enjoyed. So I'm sorry I went a little bit over. I'm happy to stick around though and answer any questions now, or I can stick around till after you're done and answer any questions. I'm all yours. Yes, sir.
We have a lot of pipes. We have a lot of, can you hear me? I can't. Okay. We have a lot of pipeline systems circumnavigating the U.S., east to west, north to south. We're pumping oil and natural gas, Lord knows what. Why can't we pump water from them that got it to them that don't, historically?
Fair question, and we get that quite a bit. 2 issues that come up right away are, number one, where would you get the water from, and then are there water rights associated with that? Essentially, does somebody own the water? I'm not as familiar with water rights in other parts of the country, but typically you have to have a source you need to be able to go to. But the bigger issue would be cost. For even if all 7 states in the Colorado River Basin agreed to foot their share of the bill to build a pipeline like that, the cost would be obviously astronomical. You'd have to figure out what land you're going to go across, whether that land is public land, whether you need to divert, you need to buy land, all of that sort of stuff. And then if there are pumping costs, because that is typically the single biggest cost you have in water treatment in general. So from Denver Water's perspective, we're pretty fortunate because almost all of our system is gravity fed. You think about our water supply up in the mountains. Our Foothills treatment plant, which is our main treatment plant, sits at about 5,800 feet in Roxborough Park. We can actually gravity feed all the way to Central Park. A lot of times when you have to pump water from your treatment plant to wherever, you have electricity costs which drive the things up. So when you're talking about sourcing the water, when you're talking about the land that you would have to either buy or acquire or whatever, the infrastructure and the costs of operating it, who would be in charge of it and all those types of things, it ultimately comes down to who would pay for it. And it would ultimately be the customers. And whether that be somebody like Denver Water, which has a large enough customer base, and we could probably spread it out, it might not be as much of a, maybe a few dollars a month, raise a bill or whatever. You talk about smaller utilities that may be doing that, where they may be looking at $20 or $30 a month. It really is it's been looked at a number of times, but it always comes down to A, where do you get the water from, how do you get it here, and who's going to pay for it? Yes, sir.
So some time ago, there was a pilot plant built with Denver Water to create potable water out of wastewater. And at the time, it was not palatable. I think despite the fact they could do it, it wasn't palatable, the notion of, what do they say, from toilet to faucet to tap. Yet places like Orange County, California now have done that successfully. Is Denver Water looking at that again as a prospect?
So In the short term, 5 years or so, probably not. Long term, absolutely. It is just another form of water reuse. So actually, that project you were talking about was actually on the site where our water recycling plant is now. And when we did it back in the day, that was in the early 80s, I believe. Back in that time, if any of you were around here, other than, you know, a few dry years here and there, water was still considered fairly plentiful. From Denver Water's standpoint, we've got a very vast, resilient system. It just wasn't anything that we felt like we needed to do. And as you mentioned, there's that issue of the ick factor. And a great story, we've actually visited with San Diego Water Utility, who opened a potable reuse plant a number of years back. Again, it's the idea of taking wastewater, putting it through I think it's about a 4 or 5 step process, typically involves reverse osmosis, and taking wastewater, turning it into tap water. Very proud of their plant, brand new, shiny. They bring the media in for a preview to kind of, you know, get people hyped up about it. And to your point, one reporter dubbed it toilet to tap. And the public freaked out. Even though every study, it met every water quality standard that was necessary, it is that ick factor. And we saw it again just back in 2018. For our 100-year anniversary, we decided to brew a commemorative beer. Our CEO said, well, that's great. We need to be forward-thinking, though. You need to brew that beer with recycled water. So on our recycled water plant, we actually set up a smaller section where we would treat, it was actually water coming from Metro that had already been treated, but we would take that, and rather than the recycled water that we turned, now we would turn it into actual tap water, and then we provided it to a brewery to brew the beer with. We brought different members, you can call them VIPs, they're not really VIPs. We brought a lot of regulators out there, CDPHE, DDPHE, a couple other different groups, people who understand what it is that we're doing, the chemistry behind this, all of that. When we provided them with the taste test, it was still that initial, and then you taste it, and it's always the same. It's always tastes like water. Aurora is doing it right now. There are 2 different types of potable reuse. There's direct potable reuse, where essentially it is toilet to tap. You take the wastewater, run it through a treatment process, and it comes out as potable water. Indirect, which is, I believe, what Aurora is doing now, introduces an environmental barrier first. You start out with wastewater, though, introduce it into environmental barrier, and then take it through the treatment process and turn out potable water. As you mentioned, there are places in Texas and California, all over the country, that are doing it. At some point, it will probably become a reality for Denver Water as well. It's not something we need to do right now and looking a few years out. But again, when we do get ready to do it, it will require a lot of public education, simply get past the ick factor. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah, sorry.
How good is the emergency preparedness or disaster preparedness? Like, for example, let's say Arkansas River had some problem with the water. Is the system interconnected so that you can still manage it okay?
So the question is around our emergency preparedness, and absolutely, we do a lot of work around different scenarios. To your question, if we were to find a source of contamination in the water, Our system is built so that we can isolate that pretty quickly. And I mentioned that idea of doing 200,000 tests a year on water quality. We do that from our source waters up in our dams and reservoirs, into our treatment plants, into various parts of our system, so that if we were to have an issue, we can isolate that very quickly. It's actually very similar to what happens with a main break. When we have one of our water mains break, and I'm sure you've seen different coverage of that, we're able to at least isolate that very quickly so that the entire city doesn't lose water. It's ideally maybe a couple of dozen customers because of the way that our system is created, so that we're able to reroute it. The bigger threats that we're facing right now, and you may have seen this in the news lately, are around cybersecurity. There have been a number of utilities over the past couple of years who've been victim of ransomware attack. And obviously that becomes a problem where you compromise the computer systems that are running a water utility. You have a lot of potential issues from there. We've built in redundancies, and obviously I can't speak too much, particularly if we're streaming this, but don't go too far into that. But we have, and we have systems built, we have our systems set up so that there are a lot of safeguards around that. And our emergency management folks, we do yearly drills and tabletops around different scenarios. Again, imagining what if. I mean, you know, to say we're never going to encounter a problem that, you know, could possibly domino, you can never say that, but it's something that our people take very seriously because obviously the water supply is so critical to public health. Yes, ma'am. You'd think.
It's probably a silly question, but since the bottled water revolution, it obviously doesn't all come from our water tables and water supplies, but a lot of it does, and we're giving it back in our wastewater. And so has there been any big impact because of that? In terms of water in, water out? I mean, have you seen over the years, we used to all drink out of our tap, and that's changed. Obviously, there's a big financial impact from drinking bottled water, but have they been able to, anything measurable?
So the interesting part is, I think it's Dasani. Is that owned by Pepsi? I think it's Dasani basically takes our water and essentially puts it through a reverse osmosis process and takes everything out. Essentially though, whether you're drinking tap water, whether you're drinking bottled water, it still ends up in the same place. No, it really hasn't. I mean, you know, depending on where you live and you know, whether you're specifically sensitive to taste and odor or something, bottled water may be the alternative. But I mean, you know, from Denver Water's perspective, we've won a lot of awards for taste and that sort of thing. And like I said, if we're essentially the basic element of some of the bottled water, so there's not really a lot of benefit. And no, I mean, it's still, whether you drink a bottle of water, whether you drink a glass full of tap water, where it goes from there essentially still ends up in the same spot. So, yes, sir.
If you lost utility electricity, if you lost, how long before homes would be and businesses would be impacted from lack of water if there was a real bad electrical outage, you know, from bad guys, let's say?
So again, that's where Denver Water is fortunate in terms of being able to gravity feed almost our entire system. And but all of our treatment plants can also be manually operated, turning cranks by hand and running a lot. I would encourage you to take a tour of one of our treatment plants to see kind of the processes that go through there. But essentially, we can gravity feed, we can manually open all of the valves that we would need to on our dams, send the water, it would specifically probably go to Foothills Treatment Plant, be able to manually do all of the processes there, and then manually feed just about the entire metro area. Would we need to ask people to cut back on non-essential water use, like outdoor watering, if it's going to be a prolonged event? Certainly. But in terms of keeping people with a water supply during, or with what we call essential indoor use for drinking, cooking, flushing toilets, those types of things, we have enough systems built in that can either be operated manually, be supplemented with generators, and then ultimately with gravity being our biggest friend, that we can operate our system, certainly not at the level that we do on a daily basis, but where it would be enough to get people through an emergency of, a couple of weeks, month or so. Again, depending on, like I said, you would certainly hear the message there. If we're in the middle of the summer, no more outdoor water usage. You would definitely cut back your usage because we would be limited in how much volume we could deliver over a certain amount of time. But it wouldn't be a thing where people would turn the taps and there wouldn't be anything there. See, I'm not stymied. Finally, yeah.
So is there a population threshold, scenarios that have been run by Denver Water where if we reach a certain population, we might have to ration?
So that's part of that scenario planning that our water resource strategy folks do, is when they're planning out 50 years, not only are they looking at, okay, what are we talking about with climate, but what are we talking about with growth? And you can base that on a number of different, obviously we've experienced a pretty big growth pattern here. And I've seen some of their models where they look at a continued path along, or a continued growth along this path, essentially double-digit growth moving forward. I've seen they also model where it's like, okay, similar to kind of what we're seeing now, Colorado's gotten too darn expensive to live here, especially in the Denver metro area. People are starting to move away. What does that look like? So there's 3 or 4 different scenarios just based on population alone. Obviously, the more that people come in here, the more you start looking at reuse and conservation and efficiency, again with the idea that you're probably not going to be able to do new supply, but it's the idea of how do you do more with reuse, how do you continue to do more with conservation and efficiency. Denver Water's service area is actually set. There's essentially a boundary that we have. So it's not as though we're continuing to expand out near the Kansas border. Now, obviously, within that service area, you're going to continue to see more people. We've seen a lot more downtown that we didn't see 20 years ago, as you see a lot of high-rises coming up and things like that. That growth is actually a little bit easier to accommodate because you're not necessarily dealing with the outdoor irrigation piece as much. You're just dealing with that essential indoor water use. But yes, that is all modeled in this scenario planning that they do. And unfortunately, we don't have the option of just saying, There's a threshold. We've reached it. Sorry, we can't do it anymore. We have to continue to figure out new ways to continue to serve a growing population.
We're past our time, so
I'm happy to stick around.
yeah, if
Take
you,
questions up here if you
yeah,
like. So.
that would be great. Thank you very much, Steve. Appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the streaming folks that are at home, and we'll see you next week.